For most people, in most cases, I believe that language is... For most people who are beginning to learn how to code, the first question burning in your mind is probably something along the lines of which programming language should I learn first, or which language is the best one to start with. Firstly, I want to say that I actually hate both of these questions because I think they're the wrong questions to ask. Anyone with a bit of experience programming knows that which language you start with is a lot less important than simply understanding the logic of programming, which is really independent of which language you're using. When to use a for loop, how to use variables, what recursion means, all these concepts are really the same no matter which programming language you're using, and if you understand them in one language, learning how to use them in a different language becomes completely trivial. It's just about learning the syntax, and using a for loop in Python is no different from using a for loop in JavaScript. The only difference is the syntax, and especially if you have access to our friend google.com, as pretty much everyone does always, you can always just Google the relevant syntax in any language you want, in any situation. But with all that being said, don't worry, I'm not gonna leave you with a cop-out answer like it depends or it doesn't matter. If I said that, then you would just go on Google anyway to Google which programming language is the best. So I'm actually gonna give you the answer. Even though there really isn't the best programming language to start with, there also kind of is. So let me just explain that. As much as I think that just learning any language and sticking with it and getting really good with it is a lot more important than which language you're learning, it is still true that there are certain advantages to starting with some languages compared to others. And even if there's just a 1% advantage to starting with language A compared to language B, you might as well just start with language A, because you're gonna have to start with some language, so you might as well start with the one that has the biggest amount of advantages for your situation. And I do believe that there is one language that for most people is probably the one that they should start with, that has the most advantages to most people given most people's situation in terms of what they want, i.e. just getting a job. So with all of those disclaimers out of the way, I do in fact think that asking which language is the best to start with is in fact a reasonable question. But before I give you the language, the last disclaimer that I need to make, that which language to start with does truly depend on what you want to do with it. For example, if you go to a course like CS50, which I review in this video, which really focuses on the computer science fundamentals, they are going to start with C, because then you're going to be introduced to concepts like manual memory management and a lot of the low-level details of how programming logic actually works under the hood. So for that purpose, something like C is probably the best. And in general, if you're doing any sort of computer science curriculum, whether self-taught or at a university, the decision of which language to start with is probably going to be made for you anyway. So in that case, the question is just redundant. For machine learning, statistics, data science, any sort of statsy data type of stuff, Python is probably the best one, simply because it's the industry leader. And I know literally nothing about game development, but I hear that they use a lot of C++. So if that's where you want to go, then C++ is probably the one that you should start with. However, if you're like most people, you probably want to learn how to code just to get a job as fast as possible, right? That's most people's goals. And even if not, when you're starting to code, at least me personally, when I was starting to code, I didn't have any specific area or like a specific goal, because I didn't know anything about the whole area of programming, so I couldn't possibly have any sort of goal. So I was just looking to start with the language that gives me the most options, and that's probably the best one to start with. And so for most people, in most cases, I believe that language is JavaScript. And let me explain why. I know there's going to be a lot of people objecting, like, how dare you make such a bold claim as to recommend JavaScript? JavaScript is so weird, it has all these quirks. And it's true, it can be a very amusing and even, dare I say, annoying language at times. Like, no kidding, they've literally built a full GitHub page that lists all of the weird, quirky features of JavaScript. It's pretty much a meme language, but there are 4 reasons that I'm going to outline that make JavaScript the best language to start programming with for most people. The first of them is that you're probably going to have to learn it anyway. Let's face it, most of us who get into programming start off with web development. Not only is the most popular form of programming, it's also where there's the most demand, and it's also the easiest and most accessible and most intuitive form of programming to get into. After all, we all use the web, and building a website is just something that you can understand easily. And so why is this an argument in favor of JavaScript? Well, if you do web dev, you're going to have to learn JavaScript anyway. Why? Because JavaScript is the single language that dominates the front end of the entire internet. Any code that you write that needs to run on the client side or in the browser essentially has to be written in JavaScript. This is not really any other option. So if you want to build any kind of dynamic web application, which you will have to do if you want to be a good web developer, you're going to have to learn JavaScript. There's just no other option. But it's not only the front end. With frameworks like Node.js, you can even do backend in JavaScript now. You don't have to use a language like Python. So knowing JavaScript essentially allows you to get two birds with one stone. When with any other language, you'd need to learn JavaScript for the front end and then a different language for the back end. If you just know JavaScript, you can just do both of them in the same language. So you don't have to divide your attention to learning two different languages, and you can just do all of it in JavaScript. Number two, it's the best language for building projects. And I know this is going to be like controversial, and again, it's going to depend on which kind of project you want to build, but probably in most cases, JavaScript is going to be the best one for building your portfolio project, especially again, if you're building any sort of web type stuff, because as I said before, you're going to have to use JavaScript to build any kind of dynamic project anyway. And for your portfolio, it's probably better to have something that's visual, something that's easy to understand. And all these kinds of projects are usually built using a framework like React, which works with JavaScript, or just by building a simple web page or a web application, again, which you need JavaScript for. And if you don't believe me, all you need to do is look at which languages are other people using the most to build their projects. JavaScript is by far the most popular language in GitHub. And I also found this very interesting infographic. Not only is JavaScript popular now, its relative popularity has been going up a lot over the past 10 years. And in my opinion, it's only going to keep going up. So this couldn't be a better time to learn JavaScript. And as I alluded to before, if you know JavaScript, you'll also have access to the very rich world of JavaScript frameworks, for example, Angular or React. And personally, I particularly love React, and it is just so easy to build web applications with. And throughout its history, the development of JavaScript has been very rapid, that there's constantly new tools, new frameworks being built around it, which does mean that you're gonna keep having to learn new things all the time. But that's just sort of the life of a programmer. If you don't like constantly learning new things, I don't really know why you're trying to learn how to code anyway. Number three, it's pretty easy to learn. Now again, yes, I understand the unsyntax can be annoying at times, and it's certainly not as simple as Python in my opinion, but all things considered, compared to a lot of languages, JavaScript does do away with a lot of the annoying features of other languages like C, for example. In C, you'd have to manually allocate your memory, which is useful for learning that thing and for learning what memory management actually means, so you should learn it eventually. But again, if you're just starting out, it's probably easier if you don't have to worry about these low-level details, which is makes it easier to get into. And if that isn't enough to convince you, there's also the arguments that because JavaScript is so popular, that means that you have so much support available for you online, on Google, on Stack Overflow, on the documentation. Any question that you want to ask, any problem that you have while you're coding in JavaScript, you can probably just Google it, like I do, like all the time.
Let me say something to you as a friend. You suck.
So as someone who frequently finds myself looking for answers in Stack Overflow, I can confirm that this perk is pretty useful. And number four is the job market. And this reason alone is probably enough to convince many people. The demand for JavaScript developers is extremely high. And I also found this very interesting infographic that shows that the amount of job seekers relative to the job openings in JavaScript is very favorable to us. Only like 0.7 JavaScript developers for every JavaScript job opening compared to like 2 point something for a lot of other languages. So if you learn JavaScript, not only are your skills in demand, but there's also relatively few people competing for those job offers, at least according to this data. But regardless, it's clear that JavaScript is one of the most in-demand languages. It's not the most in-demand language yet, but I would probably predict that that might change in the next 5 to 10 years. As we saw before when we discussed the relative popularity of languages, the popularity of JavaScript is growing much faster than other languages. So it would seem to make sense that also the job demand for JavaScript developers is going to be following at least a somewhat similar trend. There's a reason why so many coding boot camps and even online materials like Free Code Camp and the Odin Project, which is actually what I recommend to start with, and I'll talk about that in a second, focus on JavaScript so much. And there's even this one quote that I found that whatever isn't coded in JavaScript yet will eventually be coded in JavaScript or something like that. And a slight disclaimer here that obviously the relative demand for any kind of programming language is going to depend on your area. So do go on LinkedIn and actually look for the number of job openings to get the best idea of what the market is like in your particular area. So there you have it. My 4 reasons why I believe JavaScript is the programming language that you should probably start with in 2022 and beyond. Note the emphasis on most people, and in most cases, this is not the same as everyone in every case, so hold off on the hate in the comment section. But at the same time, if you do disagree on which language you should start with and you think I'm completely wrong and I have no idea what I'm talking about, do let me know down in the comments, because I do actually want to know what you guys think about this, and let me know which language you have started with. And by the way, don't think that just because you've started with something other than JavaScript, you've now done it wrong and all your time learning has been wasted. Like, not at all. Like, as I said, the most important thing is learning the logic of programming. Some languages are more different than others, but as a whole, they mostly share the same logic. If you know Python, for example, you could probably learn JavaScript to a pretty decent level in like just a couple of days. So if I did manage to convince you that you should probably start with JavaScript, your next question is probably going to be, which resource should I start with to learn JavaScript? And for this, I recommend the Odin Project. It's essentially a free online coding bootcamp that you can just do completely for free online in your own time. It's specifically focused on web development. I'm working on a full review of the Odin Project, so make sure to subscribe so you can get that. But in the meantime, if you want to see more content from me, you can subscribe to Medium using the link down below in the description, which will give you access to my blog post I'm writing on Medium. And I've been doing this for a while now, and actually writing blog posts is a lot faster than making this video. Making these videos takes a lot more work than making a blog post. So over time, there's probably going to be a lot more content on Medium than there is on this YouTube channel. Not only do you get access to my articles, you also get access to the thousands of articles on the whole of Medium. You'll also be supporting me and this channel at the same time so that I can make better videos for you. There's a lot of things that I've learned about the process of learning how to code, and really the why of why you should even learn how to code, or if you should learn how to code. And I talk about that in this video, the truth about learning to code. So I highly recommend that you go watch that video next.